What's up and welcome to my review of the Aorus 15. This laptop is designed from the grounds up to be a portable powerhouse for the competitive video game player out there. This thing has a 240Hz display, an RTX 2070 Max Q, and I weighed it in at only 4.91 pounds, which is actually lighter than Gigabyte's official weight for it. So this thing's technically under 5 pounds, and it is a 7-pound total carry weight when you throw the AC adapter in. As you can see, the AC adapter is quite thin. It's gonna fit into most backpacks, no problem. And overall, I really like this adapter size and weight considering the high performance components inside this Aorus 15. So this thing is packing some really heckin' impressive stats for especially the price point of only $21.99. This is just a freaking monster of a laptop, but it's not perfect. There's definitely some drawbacks to it. We'll get into those as we go through this review. Without further ado, let's get started. Taking a look at the specs, we have an i7-9750H. This is the latest CPU from Intel, an RTX 2070 Max Performance. So this is not a Max Q. This is designed to take advantage of the RTX 2070 as much as it possibly can in a chassis this thin and light. Then we have a 512 gig SSD and a 2 terabyte HDD as well. And then we have an extra M.2 slot as well, so if you want to upgrade that, you can easily do that. And then it has a 240Hz display, as I mentioned. Now this is less than an inch thick at 0.96 inches, and that means that this thing's still going to be very, very portable, but it's not quite as thin as something like the Razer Blade 15 or the GS65 Stealth. But this thing has a lot better performance than those machines, which we'll get into when we get to the benchmarks. Taking a look at the ports. Now on the left side, we have a micro SD card slot, which I don't know why they included that. I would much rather have seen a full-size SD card slot. Then we have a USB 3.1 Type A and an Ethernet port. On the back, we have a Kensington lock port, a USB-C plus Thunderbolt, a display port, an HDMI, and the power plug. On the right side, we have two more USB 3.1 Type A's and a combination headphone mic port. Overall, the ports are really great. The one big thing is, why didn't they include a full-size SD card reader? I mean, a micro SD card reader, what's the point? I mean, you could get a micro SD card and put it in there for a little bit of extra storage, or maybe just if you have a micro SD card in your smartphone that you transfer stuff with, but most people that use SD cards for photos and cameras use full-size ones. Okay, taking a look at the benchmarks, the 3D Mark Fire Strike, we have the Aorus 15 at $49.25. This is only about 20% behind my really expensive, really big and beefy Alienware Area 51M, so that's a really impressive overall score. Also notice that we're significantly outperforming the RTX 2080 Max Q, at least in the synthetic benchmark, by about 10%. That's a pretty significant gain, especially considering the RTX 2080 Max Q is a much more expensive graphics card. You're just getting way more bang for your buck with this RTX 2070. 3D Mark Time Spy Graphics, we have a score of 82, again outperforming the RTX 2080, but significantly underperforming compared to the RTX 2080. Again, a little over 20% difference between the two. Cinebench R15 multi-score, we have a score of 1232, which is really, really good. And this is the best CPU score throttled. So this is basically if you're running Cinebench in a loop, what kind of performance can you expect? And 1232 is certainly better than we've seen in almost any laptop with the 8750H. Now, I've seen a lot of benchmarks with the 9750H now, and it is not always beating the 8750H. It's largely dependent on how thick the chassis is that you're running the 9750H in. So if you have a better cooled 8750H laptop, it'll outperform the 9750H. So just know that if you have all things equal, both chassis are really, really good, then the 9750H should win out by a slight margin, maybe by like 5 or 10%. This right here is a good example of where you get that big power difference between the Area 51M and this thinner, lighter machine. The CPU just can't keep up with the raw render performance of the Area 51M. Here's a snapshot of the performance of the 4 games that we benchmarked with the Aorus 15 XA. So you have Fortnite hitting 292 FPS, this game's insane. I have played a lot of Fortnite, and this laptop is the best laptop experience I've ever had gaming on Fortnite. Even better than the Aorus 51M, and that's because of the 240 hertz display and the fact that in Fortnite, you can pretty much consistently hit over 240 frames per second in like the vast majority of situations in that game. Apex Legends, in the training ground, we hit 212 FPS. Now, when I was actually playing matches of Apex Legends, I was averaging closer to about 140, 150 FPS, but it's just gonna vary depending on what part of the map you're looking at. The Far Cry 5 benchmark, 101 FPS. The Witcher 3, 87 FPS. This thing is crushing these games. Of course, those games are good examples of games that you're never gonna get close to the 240 hertz refresh rate, but they're also not competitive games. You know, the competitive games are usually the ones that are going to allow you to put the settings too low, and then you're going to be able to amp the frame rates up to hit that 200 FPS plus mark, which will be much better for competitive games. So how does this laptop stack up with some of the other ones in some of these benchmarks? Well, if you compare the Far Cry 5 benchmark, you can see that we're outperforming the RTX 2080 Max-Q laptop by 3 FPS. The Aorus 51M does beat out this one by about 15%. And then of course you have the Asus GL504S from last year. This is the GTX 1070 model, and we're getting about 10% more FPS on this new updated version. So overall, we're getting really good performance on this machine compared to these other ones. Apex Legends training steps, we got 212 FPS, again outperforming the RTX 2080 Max-Q, but again falling behind the Aorus 51M by about 20%. In The Witcher 3, we again have the RTX 2070 beating out the RTX 2080 Max-Q and getting better frames per second than the GTX 1070. Though, admittedly, that GTX 1070 is doing pretty well in most of these benchmarks, and if you're looking to save some money, the GTX 1070 is a really great bang for the buck GPU. Now, I did a stress test on the Aorus 15 using the Heaven benchmark and the Firestrike physics test. Everything ran in a loop continuously for 5 minutes, and these are the temperatures and fan noise that I received out of it, and then I also calculated the clock speed. The goal of this testing is to see the maximum possible performance under a heavy dual load, which, again, this kind of stress test will almost never happen in any real world gaming experiences, but occasionally you'll get close to it. So I just like having the stress test as like the golden benchmark of if this laptop can do well in this stress test, you're always going to get better performance in real life gaming. So taking a look at this stress test results, we can see that the fan noise on Max Fan gets extremely loud at 67 decibels. The default fan only reached 57 decibels, which is a lot more reasonable. Now, the GPU temperatures with both Max Fan and default fan were really good, hitting only 73 and 81, and that's really important because we have a dual heavy load on both the GPU and CPU, and we're also dealing with 2 shared heat sinks between the GPU and CPU. Now, the downside here is that the CPU does get overwhelmed, hitting 96 degrees Celsius on average, and we are hitting thermal throttle continuous territory here. As you can see on this next graph here, we have the actual clock speeds for the CPU and GPU. The GPU averages a little bit higher in the Max Fan, hitting 1886 on average. The default fan averaging only 1769. So we're getting some kind of throttling happening on the GPU, but it's like nothing significant. Both of these clock speeds are really good, and they're very high boost clocks for an RTX 2070. The CPU, on the other hand, we're hitting an average of 3.6 gigahertz on the Max Fan profile and only 3.3 gigahertz on the default fan profile. So you're running into more significant CPU throttling with the default fan profile. So, I mean, if you're doing a very dual stress heavy game, you might run into some thermal throttling depending on the title. Now, when I did some continuous gaming in Far Cry 5, I didn't see much thermal throttling, if at all, on the CPU, but the temperatures were really high, in the mid 90s most of the time. So just know that depending on your game, you're gonna see some throttling here and there, especially if you don't repace the CPU. And I think this is a laptop that's a perfect candidate for a repace job, and then you'll see potentially a massive performance gain in a stress test like this. Another option would be getting a laptop cooler, though I don't think your gains are going to be super high, maybe a little bit. So here's the bottom. We've got one dedicated split heatsink between the CPU and GPU. We have a dedicated heatsink for the GPU here, another dedicated heatsink for just the GPU, then we have another shared heatsink between the GPU and CPU, and then we have one dedicated heatsink to the CPU here. So really not ideal cooling for the CPU, having basically only one dedicated and two shared. That's probably why we're not getting the best temperatures on the CPU. The default SSD included in here is a 512 gig Intel SSD 760p, so it's a very good quality SSD, very fast as well, so that's nice. And then we got this extra slot, so if you want to upgrade it, it's super easy. Upgrading the RAM is super easy, got them right here. Then we have the Wi-Fi if you want to upgrade that, or the 2.5-inch drive bay. Repasting this, I imagine, would involve unplugging some wires and then undoing these screws here to lift the heat sinks off, and then you'd be able to repaste the CPU and GPU to your heart's content. Overall, this is a very easily accessed bottom, except for just taking the bottom panel off. I really had to force that bottom off in order to get access to the panel. All right, checking out the laptop flex, you can see there's very minimal flex overall. We've got some around the keyboard area. The actual hinge has some wobble to it, but not much, and it's pretty firm. Like, moving it is quite a bit of effort, which is what you want in a laptop hinge. The actual chassis itself is very rigid with minimal flex anywhere, like no flex basically at all. Overall, I really like the fit and finish of this Aorus 15. Reminds me a lot actually of the GS65 Stealth. So one thing I want to be extremely clear about is that this laptop gets very loud. When it is going with max fans, it is like a freaking jet engine, one of the loudest laptops I've ever tested. Of course, the good thing here is we're moving tons of air through a very thin chassis. This is very powerful fans with a good amount of heat pipes. That's the good thing. The downside is you're definitely want headphones, and you're definitely going to annoy the people around you if you have other people in the same room and you're running it on max fan. Now, the default fan profile only reached 57 decibels, so that's a much more reasonable level and about average for most gaming laptops. Now, when you're using the laptop and it's just idling completely, it's essentially silent, but I've noticed that the fans do spin up a little bit. You might have noticed during this review, the fans kind of spin up a little bit into like medium territory here and there. Just know the laptop's not completely silent under light usage. So let's talk about the display. This thing has the 240 Hz high refresh rate, very little ghosting, extremely smooth gaming experience. I played a few matches of Fortnite and I averaged about 250 to 280 FPS in all the matches. It basically rarely, if ever, dropped below 240 frames per second. And this thing was a dream, an absolute dream to smash noobs' faces in, all right? This thing, if you're a competitive gamer and you want to be able to have a legitimate competitive advantage, a 240 Hz display is a big advantage. And that's, of course, only going to be in games that can actually take advantage of the 240 frames per second. Even if it's not hitting rock solid 240 frames per second, like in Apex Legends, I'm averaging about 150 frames per second, but I'm frequently going up to like 200 plus. You're still having moments of advantages that you wouldn't have if you had a 144 Hz monitor. The other thing that I will say about this display is that the colors are still good. You're still getting a very decent monitor and a very enjoyable monitor for multimedia and also for like video watching. Like, I had a TN panel 120 Hz on my Aorus 15. That monitor really wasn't good. It was very washed out. Well, with this one, you're still getting decent colors and contrast. And I don't have a tool to measure them precisely yet, but I have ordered it. The Spider 5 Pro is coming in, but just know that I love this display. I want a lot more laptops to be using it, and the good news is a lot more laptops are launching 240 Hz models. So 2 giant thumbs up for me on the display. This touchpad is extra wide, which gives you some more real estate. I really like that. Makes it easier to do some gestures, but it's also not very tall. So know that you kind of get this narrow aspect to it, but not very much depth. It's very smooth, and the touchpad is very responsive. I did like it a lot. The buttons are located inside and they feel great. Now, the keyboard has a really interesting layout. It's one of the most complete keyboards, especially for a 15-inch laptop. We've got a full number pad over here, which is very rare. Very few laptops of this nature have a full number pad. So giant thumbs up. The downsides here is that the number pads is just a little bit squished, a little bit narrower than you'd expect. The arrow keys are also a little bit squished vertically, so they're not quite as big and fat as what I would love, so they might not be as intuitive until you get used to them. And then these side buttons like the caps lock, tab, and tilde keys, these are also a little bit narrower than you would expect, so you'll have to get used to those as well. Overall, the keyboard feels great. The backlight, though, is not the brightest, but it is good enough in dark environments, and I guess that's really what matters. Now the battery life in this machine is really not great. It's going to be about 3 hours of medium to light usage. You don't have NVIDIA Optimus, so you're really relying on the battery size, which it's not that big of a battery. So just know that you're going to have to carry the power adapter with you if you're going to look to use this thing away from your desk for extended periods of time. Sadly, the speakers on this bad boy don't get that loud, only about 75 decibels. It's kind of average for a gaming laptop this size, but it's just kind of sad because I'm used to these amazing speakers on these thicker laptops and like the Razer Blade 15. Just know that with the mix of a loud fan noise and not very good speakers, you're definitely gonna want headphones when you're consuming multimedia and playing video games. It's just gonna be a lot better experience. In conclusion, can I recommend the Aorus 15? And I gotta say, absolutely, this is an insane value with a 2 terabyte HDD and a 512 gig SSD out of the box. You got the full RTX 2080, you got the 240 hertz refresh rate. These are some insanely good specs. And the overall package weighing at less than 5 pounds, this thing is amazing. Like for its size and for its weight category, it outperforms almost all the RTX 2080 Max-Q laptops, and then it also way undercuts them in price. The only major downsides for this laptop is not very good battery life and fairly loud fan noise, especially if you're in the max fan profile. If those two things are not deal breakers for you, pick one of these things up. I'll have a link in the video description down below if you want to pick one of these bad boys up. I hope you guys enjoyed the review. If you did, hit that like button, and if you want to see more, hit that subscribe button. I will see you guys in the next review. Brandon out.